5.3 versus 383. Does your Turbo LS really need the extra cubic inches? So the question is, if we've got a 4.8 or a 5.3 and we want to add boost to it, at what point do we need to start thinking about extra cubic inches? You know, should we bore and stroke that thing? Well, first of all, let's address the elephant in the room. The reality is that there are different ends, different extremes of the scale that we're talking about. And I'll show you what I mean. On the far end of the scale, if you want to make maximum power, you know, I'm talking about pro mod power, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 horsepower, or even more. It's always best to have a bigger motor. A 383, 483, 583, 683 with two big giant sized turbos will always make more power than a 5.3. You can't get there, you can't make that kind of power with a 5.3. So on the absolute end of the scale, on that far end, bigger is definitely better. Bigger power, bigger boost, bigger power, you know, all that stuff. On the other end of the scale is the mild end of the scale. You know, we're talking about a stock 4.8 with running 6 or 7 pounds of boost. On that application, a bigger motor really not going to benefit the guy because he has a mild combination. He's happy with a very small motor, a very low amount of boost. So he doesn't need that. On one end of the scale, definitely. On the other end of the scale, definitely not. So that's not the question. The far ends of the scale are not the question. The question is what happens in the middle, because that's where we all are. We're at the modified 5.3 liter with a cam and boost. So ultimately, we need to figure out, when do we start needing the extra displacement? I mean, when will it be beneficial? Well, here's what I think. It's less about the combination than it is about the turbo itself. You see, ultimately the turbo that we select, or turbos, will determine what the power output of our combination is. It determines what the power potential is. In the case of this video, I ran a GT45 from eBay on a couple of different combinations on a 5.3 and a 383. Not directly as a back-to-back test, but we happen to run them both with that same turbo, and it shows what happens with both of the combinations. But it also shows us that the turbo itself determines the eventual ultimate power output. In this case, that turbo is an 800 horsepower turbo. So if we pick an 800 horsepower turbo, it doesn't make any difference if we pick a 5.3 or a 383. Both of them can only make the 800 horsepower. Now, and that level works with any turbo selection. We picked this for this video, we picked this GT45, which is basically an 800 horsepower turbo. You can also pick a 900 horsepower turbo or a 1,000 horsepower turbo like an S475 or a 7875 from VS Racing, that kind of thing, and on up the scale. Whatever turbo you pick will determine what the eventual peak power output or what the potential of the combination is. Now, the combination is just going to tell you how you get to that eventual power output. And as we go up and up in turbo size, as we'll see and we will explain, it becomes necessary to go with more displacement to help get you there. As we go up to a S480 or a 96 millimeter turbo or 108 or 125 millimeter turbo, we get to a point where the 5.3 liter can no longer spool that turbo. We have to start resorting to things like, you know, quick spool valves and high stall converters and anti-lag and all this stuff to get the thing even to work. So at some point, it becomes necessary to step up in displacement. But at what point is that? Let's take a look at these two examples, try to figure it out. Naturally, the best way for me to illustrate a comparison between a 5.3 liter and a 383 is to do so kind of on the dyno. So if we take a look, this is the power output of a stock 5.3 liter, kind of typical thing that we go get at the wrecking yard. You know, it's an LM7 run with all the stuff the way that we run it, long tube headers, open throttle body, yada, yada, yada. 353 horsepower, 383 foot-pounds of torque. This was actually a pretty good one. Now you can add boost to this obviously right away, and that works well, although it makes so much more sense just to, you know, put a cam in it. So let's take a look at a modified 5.3 liter. So this is something with this one has a 224 cam in it, but it doesn't really matter. There's lots of good cams for it, and as we know, since every cam is a boost cam or a turbo cam, any cam that you put in here, when you add boost to it, you basically just multiply what's there. So on a modified 5.3 liter with a cam, you know, this thing made 440 horsepower, so it was up quite a bit. It did pretty well, but let's see. Now, it should come as no shock, really. If we take a look at the let's take a look at a modified 383. So that's this 5.3 with a 4-inch stroke and a 3905 bore. So it's a bigger bore and a bigger stroke. So that's how we increase the displacement from 324 inches to 383 inches. So as you see, and not surprising, a modified 383 stroker makes a lot more power than a 5.3, and it makes a lot more power everywhere. I mean, we've gone up, basically 60 cubic inches. And that kind of shows itself in additional power and additional torque everywhere in the curve. Now, this modified 5.3, obviously there are ways to have it make even more power. I mean, we've made as much as 500 NA, basically putting the right heads, cam, and intake on an otherwise stock 5.3 liter short block. And obviously, guys can make even more. The problem with trying to improve the power output of a 5.3 is you always start trading power down low. Now, we can already see on the cam 5.3 liter, below 3,000 RPM, we were already starting to drop power because of the wilder cam timing, and that will continue. So if we put a short runner intake manifold on, even more cam timing, a ported head, we kind of start shifting the power output. But let's say that we could easily get another 500 or 50 horsepower from the 5.3 liter. We could do the same thing with a 383. So I've had 5.3 liters that make 500. We've done 383s that make 600. So in any instance, in any kind of combination, the bigger motor will obviously make more power. There's nothing revolutionary there. Let's take a look at two combinations that we ran. One was a 5.3 liter, the other one was a 383. We ran them both with that eBay GT45 turbo. So run on a 5.3 liter. This had a Summit turbo cam in it. It was 5.3 liter, had forged internals, had TrickFlow 205 heads. And we ran it with that eBay GT45 turbo running through an air-to-water intercooler. This was at about 14 pounds. Made 776 horsepower and 786 foot-pounds of torque. The fact that it made more torque than horsepower kind of tells us a little bit about what's going on with that turbo. And that turbo basically is, for all intents and purposes, it's an 800 horsepower turbo. And we could turn the boost up a little bit. This is as far as we ran on this combination, and we weren't doing it to try to maximize that turbo, at least in this video. So if we take a look at what the 383 did with the same turbo, a little bit more power. And again, we could, if we wanted to turn the boost up on the 5.3, we could basically match that curve because we know that the turbo will support that power. But the interesting thing is, look at the torque down low. Look at it down below 4,000 RPM, and where we have the ability to match the boost curve for the two things. A bigger motor obviously is going to make more power. Again, no surprise there. But the important thing to remember here, and the thing that we want to talk about for this video, is the fact that if we've limited the power output of our combination with our turbo choice, and not that we have to. I mean, we could pick any turbo that we want. But in this instance, we picked basically an 800 horsepower turbo. So if you have an 800 horsepower turbo, we can get to whatever that turbo will support with either one of these combinations. We could get it to that power level with a cammed 5.3 or a 383. Now, we don't have to limit ourselves with that turbo. Let's say that we picked a 1,000 horsepower turbo. Let's say we picked an S475 or a 7875 from VS Racing, something like that. It could be an 800 horsepower turbo. It could be 900. It could be 1,000. Whatever turbo we select, if we pick something like that, ultimately that's going to be what determines the power potential of our combination. It's not really the combination. Lots of guys think that if they put a 383 and combine that with an S475, that it's going to make more power because it's a bigger motor and I've got an S475. Well, ultimately, think of the turbo selection as a restrictor plate, if you will. If we have a 1,000 horsepower turbo, it can make 1,000 horsepower. It's going to do that on a 383. It's going to do that on a 5.3. The only time it won't do that, you can actually have too much motor for the turbo size. And if you take a look at the video, it's right here, where I compared a 4.8 to a 454 big block Chevy, both using this eBay turbo. We saw a different extreme example for that. For that video where we ran that turbo on both those combinations, a 4.8 liter can actually make more power than the bigger 454. And I know what you're thinking, hey, what about that? It's a bigger motor, makes more NA, it's got to make more under boost. Well, it does only until you run out of exhaust flow for the turbo. So in that instance, on the 4.8 and the 454, the big 454 basically had way too much back pressure. So not only was the turbo limiting in terms of what kind of power output you could make with that turbo, it was very limited in the back pressure situation. So with a small motor with that turbo, you could actually make more power than the bigger motor because the back pressure was so high. Now on this 383 versus a 5.3 comparison, we're not quite there yet. And as we go up in turbo, that situation goes away. So instead of picking our 800 horsepower turbo, if we picked a 1,000 horsepower turbo, we can make 1,000 horsepower with both of these combinations. But as we go up and up in turbo size, if we go to an S480 or go to a 96 millimeter turbo or 100 millimeter turbo, or the farther that we go toward that pro mod side of the scale, the more problems we have with the smaller motor. Because if we get to a big turbo, we run into a situation where we can no longer spool that turbo with the smaller motor. Then we have to start resorting to things like different stall converters and quick spool valves and anti-lag and all the stuff that we have to do to make the turbo, that big turbo that we want to make a lot of power with, work with the smaller displacement turbo. So as we go up in turbo size, we get more and more of a case. We make more and more of a case for that bigger motor. And ultimately, if we get all the way to the pro mod side, big motor, big turbos, more power. So as we go up in turbo size, we get more to that end of the scale. Okay guys, what's the takeaway from this comparison between the 5.3 liter and the 383 using the same turbo? Well, the obvious stuff. 383, bigger, more turbo response, makes more power NA, makes more power under boost, and it's more expensive. It also has probably higher back pressure, so you need a different turbo. Now we covered all of that stuff. But here's the question on everybody's mind. At what point should I start actually thinking about increased displacement in relation to my turbo? And here's my opinion. Again, just my opinion, not an absolute thing. I think in the 800 horsepower range where we ran this GT45, running a 5.3 liter or even maybe a 4.8, although most people tend to overcam the 4.8 in my opinion, but running a 5.3 at that power level with an 800 horsepower turbo, even something better than our cheap eBay turbo, works well. You can get good response. It works. You don't have to really worry about spool valves or any kind of tricks to make the thing work. It's got good response. It's got good ultimate power, and that's a good combination that works. If you're trying to go way over 1,000 horsepower, 12, 13, 14, 1,500 horsepower, you should start thinking about increased displacement. I mean, I know that there are guys doing it, and you definitely can, but you have to do it with other things, like lots of stall converter, lots of RPM. You got to run 35 pounds of boost, all kinds of stuff. So I would start thinking about displacement there. The question is, what about the area in between? What about the 1,000, 1,100 horsepower range? Now, I know there are guys out there doing it, and I'm talking about the S475, 78, 75, Gen 2 kind of stuff, right in that range. Now, I know that there are guys out there doing it, running that kind of turbo with a 5.3, and it works, and you can make a lot of power. But right in that range is where you have to start thinking, hey, what about a different stall converter? What about a quick spool valve? What about anti-lag? What do I have to do to get this thing to spool up a little better? And you're in that kind of no man's land where you have to start considering that stuff. Because as you go up in turbo sizing, response rate becomes harder and harder to come by, and it gets more and more important. So that's the range that you have to start thinking about, in my opinion. 800 horsepower, no problem. 1,000 horsepower, you have to start thinking about that. Beyond that, I think you definitely should start thinking about it. So should I buy a stroker combination? In my opinion, in the 800 horsepower range, I wouldn't do it. I'd put ring gap in it and I would run it. Now, if I started to think about upgrading to forged internals, that's where you really have to start making the decision. Because in my opinion, if you're going to buy, rods and pistons to upgrade to a 5.3 or maybe go up in bore size just a little bit, I think I would just go ahead and get the forged crank also. Because you get a forged crank, and if you're going to get a forged crank, I would get the extra stroke because more displacement is always better. So if I was thinking about upgrading to a forged rotating assembly, I think I would go with more displacement. But that's just me. Let me know what you guys think. I want to know how much boost you run. I want to know what kind of combinations you run. Make sure to let me know in the comments. And I don't care if it's a stock 4.8 running 6 pounds or if it's a 5.3 in a 7-second drag race car running 35 pounds. Let me know what you guys are running. That way, I got more information. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. I'll keep testing.